Every line you answer is someone else's emergency, until the night the emergency is yours and you are the one calling. If the dark speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn to stories told in low voices at late hours, consider subscribing to Grim Masquerade. Leave a comment if this one stays with you. Share it with someone who listens in the dark. Your support keeps the mask on and the stories coming, and we are grateful for every one of you who chooses to stay. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the headset, the chair, the console, and the 712 square feet of fluorescent-lit room where I spent 8 years of my life listening to the worst moments of other people's days. I was a 911 dispatcher for the Mercer County Emergency Communications Center, which serves a population of roughly 31,000 people spread across 4 municipalities and a great deal of unincorporated land in the southern part of the state. I started in May of 2014. I resigned in March of 2022. And I am telling you this now not because I want to, but because the alternative is to keep hearing it alone. And I have learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that some sounds do not get quieter when you refuse to speak about them. They just move closer. I should tell you what the room was like, because the room is where everything happened, and you need to understand the room before you can understand why it took me so long to notice what was wrong inside it. The Mercer County Emergency Communications Center sits on the second floor of the County Services Building on Kellum Street in the town of Harwich. It is not an impressive building. Tan brick, built in the mid-1980s with narrow windows that do not open and a flat roof that pools water after every hard rain. You can hear the pooling sometimes during overnight storms, a faint spreading weight above the ceiling tiles that sounds like something large and patient settling in to listen. I noticed it my first week on the job and asked Rick about it, and he said it was just the roof, just the rain having nowhere to go, and I accepted that then the way I accepted most of what Rick told me, which was completely and without question. The dispatch center itself occupies the northeast corner of the second floor. You reach it through a locked door off the main hallway, then another locked door with a keypad. 4 digits that every dispatcher memorizes on their first day and never forgets, even years later, even when they want to. And then you are inside. 3 console positions arranged in a shallow arc facing the far wall. Each position has 2 monitors, a keyboard, a phone terminal with a row of line buttons that glow soft amber when active, a radio panel, and a headset cradle. The carpet is gray-blue and older than anyone currently working there. It carries stains that no one can identify or recall the origin of, shapes darkened into the fibers like memories the building absorbed and will not release. I used to study those stains during slow hours, tracing their edges with my eyes the way some people trace constellations, looking for patterns that were probably never there. The overhead lights are the kind that hum if you listen for them, a steady 60 hertz drone that becomes part of you after enough shifts, that settles into the base of your thoughts like sediment at the bottom of a glass you never quite empty. After a few years, I stopped hearing the hum consciously. It was still there. It was always there, but it had become the floor of my auditory world, the baseline against which every other sound was measured. I mention this because it matters later. Because when a new hum arrived, I needed time to distinguish it from the one I already carried. On the back wall, a county map under smudged plexiglass shows every road, every structure, every numbered parcel of land the center is responsible for. The map is annotated in faded marker with notes left by dispatchers from years past shorthand for problem intersections, seasonal flooding points, addresses with known hazards, a circled X on Route 12 near the quarry, a note in small capitals next to the Bridger Creek crossing that just says, Ice November to March. I used to stare at that map during slow hours and trace the roads with my eyes, following them out of town and into the hills and back, as though memorizing the geography thoroughly enough might let me feel the emergencies forming before the phone ever rang. I knew every road on that map. I knew the distances between them. And I knew, after a certain amount of time, the one address that was never annotated and never flagged and never mentioned, even though it had generated more calls to our center than half the intersections that were. Along the right wall, a row of filing cabinets holds paper incident reports going back to 2003, when the county switched systems but kept hard copies as redundancy. The drawers stick in humid weather and slide too easily in the dry cold of January. The labels are handwritten in 3 different people's penmanship, none of them mine. A coffee maker sits on a small table near the door, next to a sleeve of paper cups and a jar of powdered creamer that is solidified into a single pale mass at the bottom, impervious to the spoon, essentially geological at this point. The coffee is always burnt. Always. It has a particular taste, not just bitter, but mineral, metallic, as though the water in the building carried something the filter could not catch. I drank it anyway, every shift, sometimes 4 or 5 cups between 10 and 6, because the bitterness was a kind of anchor, a small, reliable unpleasantness that kept the night from becoming too abstract, too weightless, too easy to drift through without noticing where you were. The night shift has a way of dissolving the edges of things if you let it. The coffee kept the edges sharp, and the clock on the wall above the supervisor's desk is analog, black-rimmed, institutional, and it ticks loud enough that on quiet nights you can hear it from any console in the room. I grew to depend on that tick more than I should have. It was proof that time was passing. On the overnight shift, particularly during the long stretches between 2 and 4 in the morning when calls dropped to almost nothing, time could become uncertain. Not in any dramatic way. You did not lose hours, but minutes would stretch or compress, and the tick of that clock was the only thing that kept them honest. That is how you know that it is a quiet night. By the tick. By the space between the ticks. By the way that space stretches when nothing is happening, and the whole county seems to be holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong so you can do the one thing you are there to do. I worked the overnight shift, 10 in the evening to 6 in the morning. This was my preference. I requested it after my first 6 months on the day rotation, and I stayed on it for the remaining 7.5 years without once asking to switch back. People assumed I preferred it for the lower call volume, and that was part of it, but the real reason was simpler and harder to explain. The overnight felt like the truth of the job. During the day, the center was busy, bright, populated. There was chatter between consoles. Supervisors came and went. The phone rang with a democratic frequency: car accidents, medical assists, disputes at intersections, and it felt like public service, like the version of the work you could describe at a dinner party without anyone's expression changing. But at night, the room contracted. The lights seemed dimmer, even though they were the same lights. The map on the wall seemed larger, its roads more numerous, its distances more honest. The building settled into itself, and you settled into the building, and the boundary between the two became less distinct than it was during the day when other people were around to remind you where the building ended and you began. The calls that came in at night carried a different weight. Domestics where you could hear fear shaping the pauses between whispered words, and you had to hold your own voice so steady that it became a kind of rope the caller could grip. Overdoses where someone's friend was turning blue on a bathroom floor, and you had to walk a panicking stranger through rescue breathing while the sirens were still 6 minutes out, counting compressions in your ear, keeping your count even when theirs fell apart. Single vehicle accidents on unlit county roads at 2 in the morning where you could hear the silence of the trees through the caller's open window while they tried to describe what they were looking at. And sometimes what they were looking at was very bad, and you had to stay with them while they described it because staying was your job. Staying was the whole job. And then there were the breathing calls. Someone dials and you hear nothing but air moving in and out, and you have to decide. Pocket dial or someone who cannot speak. Someone on a floor, someone in a closet, someone standing on a bridge at 3 in the morning listening to water move beneath them. You learn to listen on overnights in a way the day shift never teaches you. You learn to treat silence as information. You learn the difference between a line that is empty and a line that is occupied by someone who has not yet decided to talk. That difference is not a sound. It is a texture, a pressure against the ear, faint and specific. You feel it the way you feel someone standing behind you in a dark room. Not a noise, a weight. We typically staff 2 dispatchers overnight, sometimes 3 on weekends. My usual partner for most of those years was Rick Moran, a man in his late 40s who had been working the console since before the digital upgrade. Rick had a routine I came to know as well as my own heartbeat. He arrived 15 minutes early every shift without fail, hung his jacket on the same hook 3rd from the left, always, even when the first and second hooks were empty and closer, and checked his console in the same precise order: monitors, radio levels, headset connection, chair height. The chair height was important to Rick. He adjusted it the same way every night, using the lever beneath the seat with a single precise motion, settling into the position he wanted the way a musician settles into the first note. Then he poured himself a cup of the burnt coffee and stood by the window for exactly 2 minutes, looking down at the parking lot. He never explained this ritual, and I never asked, but over the years I developed a theory. I think he was reading the night, taking the measure of the dark outside to decide what kind of shift it would be. You could learn a surprising amount from a parking lot at 10 in the evening. The temperature and how the sodium light hit the asphalt, the season and the angle of the shadows, the forecast and whether the windshields wore dew or sat dry under clear sky. Rick read all of it in his 2 minutes. Then he sat down, put on his headset, and became the voice that Mercer County would hear if the worst happened. He was calm in the way experienced dispatchers are calm, which is to say not calm at all, but practiced at keeping the turbulence below the waterline, where it would never reach his voice. A good dispatcher's voice is a tool. It is even, warm without being soft. It communicates control without authority, steadiness without detachment. It tells the caller without ever saying it directly that someone competent is now involved and that the situation, however terrible, is being managed. Rick had one of the best voices I have ever heard on a line, and I modeled mine after his in those early months without telling him so. I practiced in my car on the drive home, windows up, radio off, the center stripe unspooling in my headlights while the town slept around me. Mercer County 911, what is the address of your emergency? Over and over, shaping the sentence, adjusting the rhythm, smoothing the vowels, until it stopped being language and became a frequency, a tone I could produce without thought, the way a tuning fork produces its note when struck. It became the first thing I said at the start of every call, and the shape my throat held even when I was not speaking, coiled, ready, waiting for the next emergency to arrive through the wire and into my ear, and out through my voice into someone else's worst night. On a typical overnight, we would take between 15 and 40 calls. Most were routine. Noise complaints from neighborhoods where dogs barked at coyotes and neighbors called about the dogs. Burglar alarms triggered by animals or weather or sensors that had outlived their accuracy. Welfare checks requested by out-of-state relatives who could not reach someone by phone and imagined the worst, which was sometimes accurate, and usually was not. We would log each event in the computer-aided dispatch system: timestamp, call type, location, disposition, dispatch units if needed, wait for the deputy's response, update the record, and clear the call. The rhythm became a kind of breathing. Call in, log, dispatch. Clear, call in, log, dispatch. Clear. The repetition was not monotonous. It was structural. It held the night in shape the way a heartbeat holds a body in shape, not by being interesting, but by being constant. On slow nights, the rhythm stretched thin, and in the silences between calls, the room would settle into its hum and tick. And you would become aware of the building around you, the empty hallways below where the custodian had already finished and gone home, the dark offices on the first floor with their sleeping computers and their chairs pushed neatly in, and their framed certificates on the walls reflecting no light, the parking lot with its yellow sodium lamps casting long shadows from the 2 or 3 vehicles that belonged to whoever was on duty. Beyond the building, the town. Beyond the town, the county. 31,000 people in their beds, trusting without thinking about it that if something went wrong, someone would answer. You would become aware of yourself as that someone, a person in a chair in a room wearing a headset, waiting for trouble to reach you through a wire. And if you sat with that awareness long enough, if you let the silence fill in around you the way water fills a vessel, you would feel the particular loneliness of the work, which is not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being the one who is always awake, the one who listens, the one who answers. It was in that silence, in the middle of that rhythm, on a night when the county was asleep and the room was ticking and the coffee had gone cold in my cup and the map was watching from its wall, that I first received a call from 1412 Harwell Road. The date was October 14th, 2014. I know this because I have checked the log more times than I should admit, more times than serves any rational purpose, until the numbers are printed behind my eyelids, permanent as a scar. The time was 2:12 in the morning. I remember that Rick was at his console, leaning back slightly in his chair the way he did during lulls, one hand resting near his coffee cup, the other on the edge of his keyboard. The building was quiet. We had cleared our last call a noise complaint on Decker Street about 40 minutes earlier, and the silence since then had been unbroken. The line connected with that faint click that tells you the circuit is live, and I gave my standard answer. Mercer County 911, what is the address of your emergency? There was no response. I repeated myself with the deliberate patience Rick had taught me, the way you speak for someone who might be hurt or in shock or simply too frightened to find their voice. I heard the line. It was open. I could detect room tone, that faint ambient texture that tells you a connection is live, that there is a space on the other end with walls and air and surfaces for sound to touch. But no voice, no breathing, no television, no wind, no traffic, nothing I could name. Just a room, empty and present and connected to mine. I followed protocol. I repeated my questions. After approximately 45 seconds of silence, I initiated a trace. The system returned an address, 1412 Harwell Road, Harwick. I dispatched a deputy for a welfare check, logged the event as an open line with no contact, and moved on. Rick glanced over. Ghost line, I said. He nodded once, the way you nod at something beneath the threshold of concern, and returned to his screen. The deputy's report was straightforward. 1412 Harwell Road was a single-story residential structure set back from the road on a half-acre lot in an unincorporated stretch between Harwick and the town of Selby. Dark. No vehicles in the driveway. Front door locked. Windows intact. No signs of disturbance. The deputy walked the full perimeter with a flashlight and found nothing. No footprints near the foundation. No damage. No indication that anyone had been near the structure in some time. He checked with the nearest neighbor, a woman living a quarter-mile up the road, who confirmed the house had been vacant since approximately 2002. The previous owner, a woman named Denise Cortland, had died of natural causes in a care facility in another county. The property had passed through a small estate and was now held by a trust administered by a regional bank. Not for sale, not rented, not occupied by anyone for any purpose in over 12 years. No active phone service on the premises. No utilities beyond a basic electrical connection the trust maintained for insurance purposes. The deputy's disposition note ended with one line: structure secure. No contact. No hazard. Clear. I noted it. I cleared the call. I did not think about it again for 23 days. On November 6th, 2014, at 2:12 in the morning, the same line opened, the same room tone, the same silence, the same address on the trace. I dispatched another unit. The report was identical. House dark, locked, vacant, undisturbed. I cleared the call. It happened again on November 29th, December 21st, January 11th of 2015. Not every night. Not on any schedule I could identify at first, but often enough that by January, I had started keeping a separate record on my personal phone, a list of dates and times, typed into a memo app with one hand while the other held the headset to my ear. The time was always the same, 2:12 a.m. The address was always the same, and the silence was always the same. Though I want to be careful with that word because calling it silence risks suggesting emptiness, and it was not empty. It was the silence of presence without speech. The silence of someone holding a phone to their ear and listening to you the way you are listening to them. There was intention in it, patience, a quality I can only describe as attention steady, undivided, unhurried, as though whatever was on the other end had nowhere else to be, nothing else to attend to, and would wait as long as the silence required. I brought it up with Rick on a late January shift. I kept it casual, mentioning it between calls while I stood at the coffee machine stirring in the powdered creamer that never quite dissolved. watching the pale thread spiral through the dark liquid like something trying to disappear, but not quite managing. I laid out the facts, the repeat calls, the empty house, the absent phone service. Rick listened the way Rick listened to everything, without expression, chewing slowly on one of the granola bars he brought from home in a plastic bag. Oats and dried cranberries, the same brand every night, purchased in bulk from the grocery store on the bypass. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I remember precisely because I wrote it down later that night at my kitchen table. Some addresses just ring. You'll learn which ones. He said it the way you tell a new driver that certain intersections are bad in the rain. A fact of the landscape, not a mystery, a feature. I accepted that. I wanted to accept it. And for a while I succeeded. I folded the Harwell Road calls into the rhythm of the job, the way you fold an irregularity into a routine until it stops looking irregular. On nights when the call came in, I would answer, listen for a few seconds, log it, and clear it without dispatch. There was nothing to find. I had confirmed the emptiness enough times. I developed a small ritual around it, an unconscious choreography that became as fixed as Rick's 2 minutes at the window. When the 212 call arrived, I would answer, mark my log, set the headset down on the console with the earpiece facing up so I could still hear if the line changed, walk to the coffee machine, refill my cup, take one sip of the burnt coffee that tasted like the overnight shift distilled to liquid form, and return to find the line had disconnected on its own. Always after about 90 seconds, always cleanly, without the click or burst of static that usually accompanies a disconnect. The house called. I answered. Neither of us spoke. The line closed. The night continued. The clock ticked. The map watched. And in the morning, I drove home and slept without dreaming about it. Or if I dreamed, the dreams dissolved before I could hold them, which I have since learned is not the same thing as not having dreamed at all. I want to be honest about something here because honesty is the debt this account charges, and I intend to pay it in full. I was not afraid of the Harwell Road calls. Not at first, and not for a long time after. Fear was not the dominant feeling. What I felt was professional irritation braided with a low-grade curiosity I could manage the way you manage a mild ache, by favoring the other side. A ghost line. A system artifact. Old copper somewhere in the county's aging phone infrastructure picking up stray interference and generating phantom calls the system routed to a decommissioned address. Legacy systems produce noise. Noise sometimes mimics signal. You log it and you move on. What changed was the audio. In March of 2016, nearly 2 years into the pattern, the county upgraded our call recording system. The old equipment captured audio in a compressed digital format that stripped most ambient information, reducing each call to its vocal content and discarding the space around it. Voices came through, but the rooms holding those voices were flattened, made anonymous, stripped of the acoustic information that tells you what kind of space a person is in. The new system recorded in higher fidelity, preserving the full audible spectrum. The difference was immediate and remarkable. Background televisions with identifiable dialogue, wind through cracked windows carrying direction and temperature. The particular acoustics of a kitchen versus a bathroom versus a car, the hard bounce of tile, the close absorption of upholstery, the way a human voice changes shape depending on the room that holds it. For most calls, this was simply useful. More information meant better assessments, faster response, more accurate dispatch. But it also meant that the Harwell Road calls arrived with texture I'd never heard before. The first time I answered one on the new system, I noticed it immediately. The room tone was richer, more present, more dimensional. I could hear the space itself, a resonance suggesting moderate size, hard floors, bare walls, nothing to absorb sound, so every small noise was allowed to live and travel and return from the surfaces that contained it. I heard what might have been a structure settling in cold air, wood contracting deep in the framing, a sound like knuckles cracking slowly somewhere inside the walls, and beneath that, lower and steadier, something I could not name, a hum. Not electrical, not the 60 hertz drone of my own room reflecting back. Something organic and faint, like a wire held under tension, vibrating at a frequency too low to resolve into a recognizable note, or the resonance when wind passes across the open mouth of a corridor with nothing in it. It was there on every Harwell Road call from that point forward. Consistent, patient, steady as a pulse in a wrist you cannot see. I began recording the calls on my personal phone, holding it near the headset speaker during the 90-second window. This was against policy. I did it anyway. I told myself it was documentation, a precaution against the day I might need to file a formal anomaly report. But the truth was simpler and less defensible. I had started listening harder than the job required, and I wanted to listen again later, outside the center, in places where the sound could reach me without the room's own frequencies interfering. In my car after shifts, engine off, parked in my apartment lot while the pre-dawn sky bruised purple through the windshield, and the first birds tested the edges of the silence. At my kitchen table in the dark, earbuds sealed tight against the world, a glass of water going slowly warm beside my elbow that I never remembered to drink. In my bed on my side, with the earbuds still in and the recording playing on a loop so quiet it was barely louder than my own pulse, and sometimes I would fall asleep that way, and the sound would follow me down into whatever was below sleep, and I would wake with the earbuds still in and the recording finished, and a feeling in my chest like I had been breathing in rhythm with something other than my own lungs. Over months of careful listening, I noticed something in those recordings that eroded my system artifact theory with each repetition. The hum was not static, it varied. Not randomly, it varied in a way that suggested pattern. Rises and falls at irregular intervals that nonetheless repeated in sequence over the 90 seconds, like a phrase of music heard through a wall in another apartment, too muffled to identify but structured enough to recognize as intentional. It reminded me, and I have been aware of how this sounds since the moment the thought first formed of speech. Not words I could isolate, not a voice I could describe, but the cadence of language, the rhythm of someone talking at the far end of a long hallway, too distant to decode, close enough to know that meaning was being produced. That air was being shaped by purpose, that whatever was generating the sound intended it to carry information and was patient enough to keep shaping it regardless of whether anyone was close enough to receive. I did not tell Rick. I did not tell anyone. I understood that claiming to hear speech in the ambient noise of a phantom call from a vacant house was the kind of disclosure that ends a dispatcher's career quietly. A fitness review, a recommended leave, a cautionary example passed around at training conferences. I kept it private. I kept logging. I kept listening. And the listening became a second occupation inside the first, a private assignment I carried out in the margins of every shift, in every silence between legitimate calls, in the space that was always there waiting for me if I was willing to step into it. By the end of 2016, I had logged more than 40 Harwell Road calls, 2 to 4 per month, always at 2:12, always the same patient silence with its resident hum. I had not dispatched a unit in over a year. The calls were mine, part of my shift, part of my private architecture, and I think now that this was the point, that the calls were designed to become mine, to integrate so completely into my routine that I stopped treating them as intrusions and began treating them as native, as something that had always been there, the way the 60 hertz hum had always been there, the way the tick of the clock had always been there. Part of the room, part of me, and a thing that is part of you does not feel like a threat. It feels like a door in your own house that you have not yet opened, and when you finally reach for the handle, you do not feel fear. You feel recognition. In January of 2017, on a day off, I drove to 1412 Harwell Road. I had no professional justification. It was a Tuesday. Overcast, the sky sitting on the hills like a gray lid pressing the color out of everything beneath it. I took my car east on Route 9, past the feed store with its hand-lettered sign and the volunteer fire station with 2 bays and an American flag that never came down, past the church with its message board where the letters were rearranged every Monday by someone who never had enough ease, so the scripture always read slightly wrong in a way that seemed more honest than the correct version. Then south on Harwell Road, a 2-lane county road with no center stripe that winds through stretches of mixed hardwood and fields gone back to scrub. The houses are spaced widely, set behind mailboxes, leaning at angles suggesting decades of near misses with snowplows. Many carry the quality of structures inhabited by the same family across generations. Additions built in different decades with different materials, porches enclosed and reopened, outbuildings drifted slowly across the property over the years. Number 1412 sat behind a graveled drive that had mostly returned to dirt and thistle. The house was small, white clapboard siding gone gray, paint peeling in long vertical strips that made the walls look like something shedding a skin. A covered front porch with 2 wooden posts and a sagging rail. Asphalt shingle roof, intact but moss-covered on the north slope where the sun never reached. 2 visible windows, both curtained thin fabric that might once have been yellow and was now the color of old paper, of something that had waited so long in one position it had taken on the tone of the light that touched it. I parked at the end of the driveway, left the engine running for a moment, then turned it off. The quiet was immediate. No traffic, no birds. Just the tick of my cooling engine and the creak of the car adjusting to stillness, and beneath those sounds, a silence so total it had its own texture, like the air inside a closed hand. I looked at the house for a long time. What I felt was not curiosity and not dread. It was recognition. Not of the house I had never seen it. Recognition of the silence around it. The identical texture of quiet I heard through my headset at 212 every few weeks. The same sense of a space occupied not by a person but by an attention. An awareness without a body. A listening that did not need ears. I did not go inside. I sat 15 minutes watching the house with the slow attention you give something you suspect of watching you back, then drove home. But something shifted that afternoon. Something settled into place with a small, decisive sound, like a latch catching in a door I had not known was a door. The house was real. The silence was real. Whatever occupied that silence was not a system artifact, and no amount of Rick's pragmatism or my own careful reasoning could make it one again. The calls continued through 2017 and into 2018 without variation. 2 to 4 per month, always 212, always the same silence. I logged each one and said nothing to anyone, and the months accumulated like pages in a book whose subject I still could not name. And then Rick retired. His last shift was a Thursday overnight in April of 2018, quiet enough that we spent the slow hours talking in the way people talk when one of them is leaving, and both know it. Rick told me about the early years, rotary phones, paper logs written in pencil that smudged if you rested your hand wrong on the page. The first computer system that crashed so often they ran paper backup for 3 full years. He told me about calls he still carried. A house fire in '98 where he talked a 12-year-old through lifting her infant brother out a back window while the front of the house was fully involved, and the sound of the fire was so loud on the line he had to raise his voice, the only time in his career he had done so on a call. A domestic in '05 where the caller whispered for 9 consecutive minutes while her husband searched the house room by room, and Rick held the line at her volume and dispatched units without ever exceeding the whisper she had set, because matching her voice was the only way to tell her she was not alone without telling the man in the hallway that she was talking. He told me these things the way veterans tell the stories they cannot set down, not to impress, but to transfer weight, to make sure someone would carry them forward. I almost told him about Harwell Road, the words assembled in my throat, arranged in order, waiting. But I could not open the valve. The years of silence around the calls had become structural, a wall, and behind the wall, a room. And showing anyone the room would mean explaining not just what was inside, but why I had sealed it. And the cost of that explanation felt larger than the cost of continuing alone. I shook his hand. He pulled on his jacket for the last time. He walked to the door and paused there for a moment, looking back at the room in a way that made me think he was saying goodbye, not to me, but to the space itself. To the hum and the tick and the map and the smell of burnt coffee that had been the constant backdrop of his professional life. Then he left. At 2:12 that night, the call came in, and I answered it alone for the first time. And the solitude of that moment, one dispatcher, one empty house, the entire county asleep in the wire between them, had a clarity I had not expected, a purity, like hearing a single note held in a cathedral after the last person has gone. My new overnight partner was Teresa Garza, late 20s, transferred from a larger center in the adjacent county, sharp, thorough, the kind of dispatcher who cross-referenced call logs from previous shifts and retained the details weeks later. I liked her. I also recognized that her attention was a searchlight, systematic, persistent, difficult to evade, and I had things positioned carefully in the dark. She noticed the Harwell Road calls within her first month. She was at the secondary console one night when the 212 call arrived. She watched me answer, listen, log it, clear it in under 2 minutes without dispatching anyone. She asked what it was. Ghost line, I said. Known artifact, old infrastructure. She accepted it with the particular skepticism of someone who writes things down rather than discarding them. 3 weeks later, on a slow night, barely a dozen calls deep by midnight, she brought it up again. She had pulled every logged call from 1412 Harwell Road since 2014 and counted them. She turned her monitor toward me. 114. She asked in a tone casual on the surface and deliberate underneath whether I didn't find that unusual for a system artifact. I said the copper on Harwell Road was aging and these things persisted in legacy systems. She looked at me for a moment that lasted 1 beat longer than it should have, holding something in her expression that was not suspicion and not concern, but occupied the precise space between them. And then she nodded and turned back. In the quiet that followed, I felt two things with equal clarity: that she did not believe me, and that I needed her to stop looking, not to protect a secret, to protect a frequency. In August of 2019, the audio changed. I was alone. Teresa was out sick of a stomach virus working through the county that week. The backup dispatcher covered radio from the supervisor's desk but was not monitoring phones. 11 calls since 10, all routine, all cleared. My coffee had gone cold. The building was deep in its overnight stillness, the hum, the tick, the periodic creak from the hallway. I watched the second hand on the clock complete its circuit. At 2:12, the line opened. I answered. I heard the room. I heard the hum. And then, for the first time in 5 years, I heard something else. A voice. Not a word. A single vocal sound, brief and low, shaped like a syllable without clear consonants. It rose out of the hum the way something rises from the bottom of still dark water, visible for 1 instant, catching the barest available light, and then gone. Perhaps a second, perhaps less. The room returned to its silence. 90 seconds later, the line disconnected. I did not move for a long time. The backup dispatcher glanced over. I nodded. Fine. My hands were steady on the desk. My breathing was controlled. But behind my sternum, in the place where the body stores its oldest warnings, something had opened that I understood immediately would not close again. Because the sound was familiar. Not the way a word is familiar when you have heard it before. The way your own reflection is familiar when you catch it in glass you did not know was there. Familiar at the level of bone and resonance. Of the specific vibration that lives in your chest when you speak and that you hear differently from anyone else on earth, because you hear it from the inside. The voice sounded like mine. I need to be precise because I understand the distance between what I perceived and what I can demonstrate. I had no personal recording of that call. I had grown complacent in the sameness of the Harwell Road events and stopped holding my phone to the headset weeks earlier. The county system captured it, but access required a formal request tied to an active incident, and there was no incident. There was only me in a chair at 2:13 in the morning, having heard a sound from a house where no one had lived for 17 years that carried the frequency and grain of my own voice, returned from a depth I could not measure. I told myself it was coincidence, that low vocal sounds share characteristics, that years of listening to the same source through the same equipment had calibrated my perception unreliably. I built these explanations the way you build a retaining wall piece by careful piece, packed tight, and believed none of them. But I logged the call and cleared it, and the night carried on. The voice returned on September 4th, October 1st, October 22nd, always a single syllable, always rising from the hum and sinking back. Each time the recognition was sharper, like a lens being turned by a hand that would not stop until the image was perfect. That November, I went back to the house, a Saturday near midnight. Cold air, clear sky, heavy with stars in the way you only see outside of town. The house a dark shape against darker trees, no light anywhere nearby. The nearest occupied dwelling a quarter mile up the road with a single porch bulb glowing faint yellow through bare branches like something trying to remember warmth. I stood in the driveway and listened. Beneath the insects and the distant dog and the wash of a car on Route 9, the house produced a sound. Not the hum I heard through the phone. Lower, deeper, felt more than heard. A vibration from the ground beneath the foundation, as though the earth itself were resonating at a frequency just below human perception. I felt it through my boots, up the bones of my legs, into the base of my spine. Steady, patient, old beyond any measurement I could apply. Not the sound of a house, the sound of what a house is built on, what it covers, what it keeps. I stood 10 minutes, drove home, sat in my dark apartment for 2 hours, listening to the refrigerator and the heat pump and the upstairs neighbor's footsteps crossing and recrossing a room, trying to reassemble the ordinary world into something with edges I could trust. Through 2020, the voice continued to sharpen, still one syllable, but gaining consonants, gaining the interior structure that separates a noise from a word. By summer, I was nearly certain it was forming something specific. By fall, after hearing it call after call through August and September and October, each iteration a fraction clearer than the last, I was certain I knew which word it was. My name. The first syllable. The opening sound. Shaped with increasing precision by a voice that matched my own fundamental frequency, spoken in a house empty for 18 years, carried through a line that did not physically exist, received by the one person in the county whose entire function was to answer when called. It felt like standing before a mirror in the dark and watching the reflection lean toward you a fraction of a second before you move. Not a copy, not an imitation, the original. And it has been there longer than you. By early 2021, I was sleeping 3 broken hours a day. The hum had migrated. It was in my apartment walls, my pipes, my ductwork. Present when I closed my eyes, when I opened them, on the drive to work, at the console between calls. It was everywhere, which meant it was no longer coming from the house. It was coming from me, or through me. Or the distinction had eroded to nothing. In June, I asked my supervisor, Karen Llewellyn, to pull the phone infrastructure records for Harwell Road. I framed it as a technical concern, the recurring calls suggesting a possible failing trunk line. The carrier responded 3 weeks later. No active service at 1412 Harwell Road. No connection. No copper pair. Service terminated November 2002. Line physically removed 2007. There had been no wire for 7 years before the first call reached my console. Karen put in a vendor ticket. It closed in 30 days. Non-critical anomaly. No resolution. The calls did not pause. I also filed a request to access the full recording archive, citing a quarterly anomaly audit I invented as justification. Karen approved it without scrutiny. I received every Harwell Road recording from the 2010 system migration forward. Before October 2014, there was nothing. Not one call. The address had been silent in the system until the month I joined the overnight shift. I turned that fact over under every light I could find. It did not change shape. I reviewed the recordings at my kitchen table in the dark, earbuds sealed tight. The early calls, 2014 through early 2016, were flat, compressed, silence without architecture. But from March 2016 onward, the texture was unmistakable. The hum, the space, the presence. I played the August 2019 recording 11 times. I isolated the vocal frequency with software and compared it to my own voice. Fundamental frequency, within 3 Hz. Formant structure, the overtone pattern that makes a voice uniquely itself, flagged as a probable match. I closed my laptop, sat in the dark with my palms flat on the table, and allowed myself, for the first time, to look at the full shape of what was happening, without building anything between us. In October of 2021, 7 years after the first call, I went back to 1412 Harwell Road at 2 in the morning. I parked in the driveway, clouded sky, the dark total and closest cloth over the face. I walked to the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, 1, 2, 3 each. Sounds so physical, so rooted in the ordinary mechanics of wood and gravity, that it nearly broke whatever had been building in me for 7 years. Nearly. I pressed my ear against the front door. The hum was inside, unmediated, not compressed by a codec, not shaped by a headset speaker, not carried across miles of wire that did not exist. The direct sound, the original. And it was not pipes, not wiring, not a foundation settling under thermal load. It was air being shaped by intention. Sound produced for the purpose of being heard by someone standing at this exact door at this exact hour. My phone read 2:07. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The dark inside had weight and substance. It had accumulated for nearly 20 years, undisturbed, layered in strata like geological time, and stepping into it was like stepping into still water, a resistance, a density, a medium full of its own presence. The air smelled like dust and cold wood, and something faintly mineral, like water drawn from deep stone. Bare hardwood under my feet, my steps sharp and solitary. I could make out only shapes, the line of a wall, a door frame, the faint gray rectangle of a curtained window admitting no useful light. I did not use a flashlight. I did not turn on my phone. I stood in the dark of a house where no one had stood in almost 20 years. And I waited. At 2:12, my phone rang. Not vibrated, rang. A clear, bright, sharp tone that detonated in the dead air of that empty room like a physical blow, like a hand laid flat against my sternum. I had not set it to ring. It had been on silent for months, but it rang, filling every corner, returning from the bare walls and the bare floor and the ceiling I could not see. And I answered it because that is what I do, what I have always done. The reflex that lives below thought and below choice in the place where 8 years of muscle memory are stored, in the groove that has been worn so deep the body moves through it before the mind can intervene, and I said the words, "Mercer County 911, what is the address of your emergency?" And the voice that came back was mine, not similar, not close, not a probable match within an acceptable margin. Mine, my voice, my cadence, my breath between syllable groups, my specific way of shaping a pause. My voice saying my name clearly and without distortion, the way a dispatcher reads an identification from a screen professional, certain, unhurried, as though it had spent 7 years in that room practicing one word in one voice, and had tonight, with me standing in the dark it had been speaking into all along, finally achieved it. The line went dead. The hum stopped. The resonance that had lived in the walls and the floor and the air ceased in a way that felt less like ending and more like arriving. Like the silence was not an absence, but a completion, the final note of a composition that had been playing for 7 years and needed me inside the room to finish. The air was just air. The dark was just dark. The house was just a house. I walked out. I crossed the porch. I got in my car. I drove home. I did not go back. I resigned in March of 2022. Told Karen it was burnout. She did not argue. Dispatchers burn out. It is expected, budgeted for, absorbed by the system without surprise. Teresa shook my hand on my last shift and held the grip 1 moment longer than necessary. And in her eyes, I read something that told me she had understood more than she had ever asked about, and she released me without questions, which was a kindness I have thought about many times since and have never found a way to repay. For months after, I listened to the recordings I had made, obsessively. I mapped them on a timeline. I annotated every shift in the hum, every emergence of the voice, every incremental step toward becoming me. I built a detailed picture of a sound that had learned, over the course of 7 years, to replicate my voice from raw material I had supplied each time I answered the line. Thousands of repetitions. Mercer County 911, what is the address of your emergency? Each one a lesson, each one a donation of frequency and breath and the particular architecture of me rendered in sound and delivered into a silence that was taking patient, meticulous notes. Then I stopped. Not because I found an answer, because I found a question I could not set down, and carrying it was remaking me into someone I no longer recognized. If the voice was mine, learned, assembled, perfected over years of patient collection, then who was the caller? Who opened the line in October 2014? Who chose 212? Who aimed the silence at the one console where I sat? The answer I keep reaching, no matter the route I take, is that the caller was also me. That somewhere in the architecture of wire and signal and silence that connects one point of need to another, a version of me had been speaking before I ever sat down. That the house did not learn my voice, that my voice had always been there, that I did not train the silence. The silence trained me. That 8 years of answering, of pressing the headset to my ear and leaning into the dark on the other end of every call, had been the process by which I was slowly, patiently, irreversibly tuned to the frequency of a room I had never entered until the night I entered it, and heard myself already speaking. I live in a different county now. I work a different job, one that does not require a headset or console or sitting in a room at 2 a.m. waiting for someone's emergency to reach me through a wire. I do not listen to recordings. I deleted the files from my phone and my computer, though I know the county's copies exist somewhere in a server, time-stamped and categorized as a non-critical recurring anomaly that no one will ever have reason to review. But sometimes, late at night, in the quiet of my apartment, I hear the hum. Not from outside, not from the walls or the pipes or the building's machinery. From inside. From the place where voice begins, where air crosses tissue and becomes language, where intention takes the shape of sound. It is there the way a dial tone is there when you lift a receiver, a carrier signal, a channel, open and patient and waiting. I do not know if the calls are still coming into the center. I have not asked. I have not contacted Teresa or Karen or anyone in Mercer County. I have severed every physical connection to that building, that console, that headset, that chair. But I know, with the certainty of someone who has heard his own voice speaking from a place he has never been, that the channel has not closed, that the conversation has not ended but has simply moved, from the wire to the hum. From the infrastructure to the inside of my own attention, from the house on Harwell Road to whatever room I happen to be occupying when the hour arrives and the quiet deepens, and I become aware once more of the sound beneath all other sounds. The sound that is not silence and not speech, but lives in the narrow space between them, patient and steady and familiar, because it has been practicing the shape of my name for years in a room where no one lives. Some nights I catch myself listening for it, for the ring, for the faint click of a circuit engaging across a distance that has nothing to do with miles. And some nights, in the tick of my kitchen clock and the hum of my refrigerator, and the ordinary quiet of a life that is by every external measure normal and whole, I hear something that is not a ring, but is not nothing. A vibration, a readiness, the sound of a line that is open and waiting for someone to speak. And I am afraid, not of what might come through, of the possibility that I have already answered, that I answered a long time ago before I knew there was a question being asked. That the version of me inside that empty room picked up the phone before I was ever hired, before I sat down at the console, before I pressed a headset to my ear and said the words that started everything. That my 8 years in that chair were not a career, but a response, an echo that mistook itself for a voice. I do not know how to end this because I do not believe it has ended. I could tell you that I am fine, that the hum has faded, that distance has given me clarity and peace. But the hum has not faded, and the distance has changed nothing except the acoustics of the room I hear it in. Some mornings, standing at my kitchen sink filling a glass of water, I hear myself say something under my breath that I did not choose to say. A syllable, a fragment. The beginning of a sentence I cannot finish because I do not know where it leads or who started it. I stand there with the water running and the glass in my hand, and I listen to the shape of the sound I just made, and I wonder whether I said it or whether something said it through me, using the instrument of my voice the way a caller uses a telephone line, passing through me to reach someone on the other end. And if there is someone on the other end, if this telling is itself a call, then let it be the record, the timestamp, the log entry for a line that opened in October of 2014 and has never closed. I am the dispatcher and I am the caller, and I am the address, and the emergency I reported from a house where no one lives is the same emergency I am reporting now, that I cannot tell the difference between answering and calling, between hearing and speaking, between my voice and the voice that learned to be mine in a room I should never have entered at an hour I should never have been awake. I answered emergency calls for Mercer County for 8 years. I answered every one, and the one call I could never clear, the one caller I could never help, the one voice I could never identify, it was mine. It was always mine. Speaking from the other side of a line I didn't know I had opened, in a room I didn't know I was building, to a version of myself that had been listening since before I sat down, and will be listening long after the last dispatcher locks the door and drives home in the dark and sits in the parking lot and hears, beneath the insects and the engine tick and the ordinary silence of a night with nothing wrong in it, the faint and patient sound of a telephone ringing in a house where no one lives, at an hour when no one should be calling, in a voice that knows your name because it learned it from the inside.